Welcome, everybody. I'm Matt Goodwin, and today I'm going to be talking about what has happened to Britain's Labour Party. And the reason I wanted to talk about this, number one, is because the Labour Party has just announced the findings of an internal review as to why it lost the 2019 general election. And the second reason was because I've just finished a really interesting research project with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. Some really great people working there. I urge you to follow them and engage with them. And I want to share some of the findings from that project with you. And more generally, I'm going to draw on what you can see here, which is a few years of research on political churn and change, mainly but not exclusively in British politics. Just before we get going, it would be great if you can hit the subscribe button, if you can like the video. I'm trying to share some research. Hopefully it's of interest to you and students and lots of other people, and it would be great if you could help me try and build this channel. You can also engage on Twitter at GoodwinMJ. Okay, so let's start here. This is a basic story for centre-left social democratic parties since the 1950s, and you can really see how from 2005 onwards these parties start to have a pretty bad time of it. The kind of golden age, if you like, was in the final few decades of the 20th century, and then things really started to come apart. And particularly from 2010 to where we are today in 2020, we saw a number of centre-left parties across Europe have a really difficult time, often falling to record lows. We also, of course, not only saw the vote for Brexit in the UK, which challenged the internationalist orientation of centre-left social democracy, but we also saw the election of Donald Trump in the United States, Bolsonaro in Brazil, and a lot of other populists doing well in Europe. And all of this has sort of fed this global debate about the crisis facing social democracy. So whenever anybody's looking at Britain's Labour Party and they say this is just about Jeremy Corbyn, this is just about Brexit, I would urge you to remember that this is a broader ideology that is experiencing some real problems. Back in Britain, this is the basic story of the Labour Party from the beginning of the 20th century all the way through to the election that we're going to be looking at today, the 2019 general election. And again, this is a pretty consistent story with what I've just shown you. You can see how the Labour Party, which of course was founded to represent the working class, starts to really do well with Clement Attlee in 1945, starts to build the welfare state, and remains the second major party, replaced the Liberals earlier than that, but basically remains one of the big two parties in British politics all the way through. Has a really bad time of it in 1983 with Michael Foot, sort of radical left-wing leader. Neil Kinnock starts to bring them back, and then of course we enter the heyday of Tony Blair and New Labour. Three huge general election victories in a row. Gordon Brown tries to take the baton, is unsuccessful. Similarly, Ed Miliband, and then we enter into the Corbyn era. So this is a sort of party that's kind of ebbed and flowed. But recently, as we saw in December 2019, the Labour Party has now gone back to really the lowest number of seats that the party has ever had since 1935, which is pretty dramatic. And as I said earlier on, this is pretty consistent with the collapse of centre-left social democratic parties in many other democracies. So Boris Johnson wins the 2019 general election, and he does so by painting a lot of the country blue. And he effectively brings the Conservative Party its largest majority since Margaret Thatcher's second landslide in 1987. He also brings the Conservatives 44% of the national vote, which was its highest share since Margaret Thatcher first came to power in 1979. And remarkably, this means that the Conservative Party has now increased its share of the vote at every general election since 2001. And let me say that again, at every general election since 2001, the Conservative Party has increased its national share of the vote, which is quite a run when you think about it. It also means that the Conservatives won a solid majority despite having spent the best part of a decade in power. David Cameron first led his party back into government in 2010, was obviously there for the shadow of the financial crisis, was there during austerity and the economic squeeze, was there during the referendum on Scottish independence in 2014 and then Brexit in 2016. And despite being in office during all of that, the Conservative Party then wins a big majority at the end of the decade with Boris Johnson. And the reason I have shown you this map is because England is absolutely essential to all of this. As we'll see in a second, Boris Johnson and the Conservatives basically hoovered up the vote in non-London, non-university town England. The Labour Party have still not won the popular vote in England since 2001. And let me say that again, the Labour Party have not won the popular vote in England for nearly 2 decades, which again is pretty remarkable. And so how can we explain this? So what I want to do is just go back to the referendum on Brexit for a second. And here's the map, which shows you how the country split at that somewhat notorious and very divisive referendum, which went 52% leave and 48% remain. And you can see how that support breaks down. When you trace that vote and you translate it into parliamentary constituencies, as my colleague Chris Hanretti has done, then this is where you begin to see why Boris Johnson and the Conservatives have had an ace up their sleeve. More than 60% of all constituencies voted to leave the European Union, while the Remain vote, as you can see on the map, was much more concentrated in the university towns like Oxford and Cambridge, Brighton, Bristol, also, of course, London and across Scotland. So the Leave vote essentially already was much more consolidated once you translated it into those parliamentary constituencies. So once Boris Johnson decides that this 2019 election is going to be all about Brexit, about Parliament's failure to deliver the Leave vote, and he goes after Leavers, he's basically already got a really big inbuilt advantage, so long as he can actually unify those Leave voters. And that's exactly what he does. This is some work by colleagues at the British Elections Study. And just before I break this down, one of the things to keep in mind is what happened in 2019 is that of the more than 401 seats that were estimated to have voted for Brexit in 2016, the Conservatives actually ended up winning 73% of them. So they basically walked away with nearly 3/4 of all those seats that voted Leave. And this chart, which you're looking at now, really underpins that. What it shows you is how Leave voters basically realigned themselves around the Conservative Party. Between 2015 and 2019, the percentage of Leave voters, people that wanted to exit the European Union and also typically wanted to reduce the level of migration, the percentage of those voters standing behind the Conservatives rockets from around 44% to over 70%. And this allows the Conservatives to basically cannibalise the vote for Nigel Farage's UK Independence Party, the vote for the Brexit Party, the sort of successor to UKIP, and also, as I'll show you, it allows the Conservatives to eat into the Labour vote. And this is what gives Johnson the serious firepower that you saw at the 2019 election, because he's now got a really consolidated base of support. Meanwhile, on the right, you can see how the Remain vote is really much more conflicted and divided. Remainers did not go into the 2019 general election in the same way, with the same coherency as Leavers. They stayed more divided between the different parties. And that was partly because they were alienated by the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, who was sort of a radical left-wing figure who was struggling to keep his party united amid allegations of anti-Semitism. And so they didn't really find the Labour leadership particularly appealing, whereas Leavers really did like Boris Johnson. And so the moment this election was framed as being a Brexit election, well, the Remain side already was in trouble. So one reason why Johnson wins is not only because he consolidates that Leave vote, but because of what happens in the Red Wall. The band of Labour seats that runs from North Wales all the way across to Great Grimsby on the East Coast. And you can see on the left, the map of the 2017 general election outcome, the cluster of red seats along that red wall. And then on the right in 2019, you can see how that wall really starts to fall apart. And what's interesting is we had this election in 2017, a year after the Brexit referendum, and Prime Minister Theresa May has said that Brexit means Brexit. She's going to tackle the burning injustices. She tried to reach out to the working class. Her advisor, Nick Timothy, who's recently written an interesting book on this, he was very integral to that strategy. He said, this is where the space is in British politics. Now, Timothy's diagnosis was correct, but the execution was pretty poor. The Conservatives ran a bad campaign. And also, there were some changes on the Labour side. Under Jeremy Corbyn, Labour said that they would respect the referendum result while also delivering radical economic reforms to try and make the country a fairer place. And the key issue is, in lots of these red wall seats, working class voters were what we call cross-pressured. They leaned to the left on the economy. They thought the system was rigged. They wanted the state to give them a helping hand. They wanted the landscape to be sort of leveled up. They felt that it was working against them. But on cultural and identity issues, they leaned right. They wanted to leave the European Union. They wanted to reform immigration. They wanted a tougher approach on law and order. And they were more instinctively patriotic. And all of this really paints the backdrop to where the real space was in British politics. And I've argued for many years that that space is not where many commentators think it is. Lots of commentators that had a difficult time with Brexit and had a difficult time really with the past decade in British politics tried to argue that that space was really there for a sort of new liberal Blairite party. And that was just never the case. It was instead in this cross-pressured area where you can pitch to voters around economic security, but also around cultural security. So in 2017, Theresa May sets the train in motion, but it isn't going very fast, and she wins just 6 pro-Leave Labour seats. But what she does do, and I think historians, if you like, in the future will be softer on May, because she starts to whittle down lots of those Labour majorities, and that basically paves the way for Boris Johnson in 2019, and he comes along and takes 54 seats from Labour, and 50 of those seats had voted to leave the European Union. And these are what we call the sort of heartland seats. So if you look at that northern band and how it turns blue, there's seats like Great Grimsby, which has been Labour since 1945, Bishop Auckland, Labour since 1935, Bassetlaw since 1935, Wakefield since 1932, Don Valley since 1922. These are all sort of industrial, working class communities that have suffered from decades of chronic underinvestment, and where, to be frank, people have good reason to feel angry at the existing settlement because it has not worked very well for them. And all of this contrasts sharply to what's going on in Remain areas. Labour only wins 41% of the 231 or so seats that voted Remain. And that's largely because Labour is facing competition from the Scottish Nationalists up in Scotland, the Liberal Democrats in university towns and parts of London, and also, crucially, still the Conservatives, who, despite campaigning hard on Brexit, managed to retain 1 in 3 seats that voted to remain in the European Union. How were they able to do this? Partly because their opponents were divided, but also because a lot of Conservative Remainers ultimately put their party loyalty ahead of their Brexit loyalty. There is a reason why the Conservatives are one of the most successful political parties in the Western world. They know how to hold on to power, and they are ultimately a deeply pragmatic party. Okay, so what is crucial to all of this, and what I want to talk about in a bit more detail today, are the people who switched over to Boris Johnson and the Conservatives. The working class, those on low incomes, people who are vulnerable to falling into poverty, and who often had few educational qualifications. And many of the Conservative gains in these areas, like the Red Wall, where average wages are low and people are struggling, were really driven by these voters. So we really want to understand what's going on. And I know many of these areas that we're going to talk about. One side of my family is from Salford in Manchester. My grandfather worked in a steel factory 7 days a week. And the other side of my family is from the valley towns in South Wales, near Swansea or Llanelli. So the Brexit vote and sort of what happened afterwards really made sense to me, in that I've grown up and I know those communities very well. And the point about all of this is that the political turbulence that has unfolded in British politics has been a long time coming. And I've been warning for a few years that this was basically about to happen, and I'll explain why through this chart. So this is some work that I've done with Ollie Heath at Royal Holloway, who's another academic like me, and what it shows you is the relative strength of Labour and the Conservatives in seats that have a large working class population. And it takes you from 2010 through to 2019 and basically tells you the story of what's happened. And in 2010, you can see that Labour still enjoys a healthy lead over the Conservatives in seats that have a large percentage of working class people. But then at each successive election through 2015, 2017 and 2019, it's almost like a falling ladder if you watch that line and how it just tips over gradually through those elections. And this is really showing us how Labour has lost its competitive edge in these working class heartlands. And by 2019, it essentially has no advantage over the Conservatives among the working class, which is quite a striking thing to say, given that Labour was founded to represent the working class. So this is a real watershed moment for a party that essentially its reason for being, its reason for coming into British politics was to speak for these communities, but it no longer has any meaningful advantage within these communities. So let's take some data on median earnings in each seat and just look at how support for the different parties changes between 2010 and 2019. Because one of the things that the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and I'm also interested in is just looking in particular at some of these low-income communities and what's going on. And what we're looking at here is a line of best fit between the average earnings in a seat and the party's vote share. And what you can see again from 2010 to 2019 is that Labour has always tended to perform much better in areas that had low average earnings. And Labour, as you can see with that red line, tends to perform weaker in areas that had high average earnings. In contrast, the Conservatives historically tended to do much better in well-off areas than in areas that had low earnings. But this then basically is flipped on its head. As we pass through these elections and go to 2019, it is the Conservative Party, ironically led by somebody who passed through Eton and Oxford and is in essence the embodiment of Britain's establishment. It is Boris Johnson and the Conservatives who now advance much more strongly into these low wage areas and become more popular than Labour, which is basically a remarkable thing to see in British politics. Whether we define these constituencies in terms of earnings, class, or educational qualifications, a similar picture emerges. The Conservative Party is now making great advances in places which historically voted for the Labour Party. And this is what allows the Conservatives to capture seats like Blackpool South, Great Grimsby, and Stoke-on-Trent North, where median wages are low, often big, heavy industry is collapsed, and lots of voters in these seats are cross-pressured. They're leaning left on the economy, but they're instinctively socially conservative on questions of identity and culture. Now, this isn't cost-free for the Conservatives. While they're making big gains in some of these communities, you also see the Liberal Democrats, as you can see in the 2019 chart here, beginning to do better in areas that have higher wages and where people are on higher incomes. And this points to a potential future problem for the Conservatives. It's winning these areas like Great Grimsby, but it's also losing votes in more affluent middle-class professional areas. So let's just turn away from these areas and look at individuals for a minute, because this is a really interesting part of the story. And to do that, we can draw on some really valuable survey data from the British Election Study. And this has a nice panel component, which means that we can look at the same people over time, which is pretty cool. Here we can see how people on low incomes and high incomes moved between 2017 and 2019. And we can see how only a few years ago in 2017, Labour was still enjoying a narrow lead among people on low incomes, around 40% to the Conservative Party's 39.7%. But only 2 years later in 2019, this is turned on its head. It's now the Conservative Party that is doing much better among low-income voters, and it is the Labour Party that is falling behind, in fact, by quite a big margin. And so for the first time in recorded history, the Conservative Party is outpolling the Labour Party among people who are living on low incomes and who are at risk of poverty. This again is pretty remarkable and points to a longer-term challenge for the Labour Party that somehow, under its new leader, Sir Keir Starmer, needs to find a way of repairing this relationship, while the Conservative Party needs to find a way of retaining this support among these voters. In fact, in 2019, the Conservatives were more popular among people on low incomes than it was among people on high incomes. And that, again, is a pretty remarkable thing to say in British politics. Who was switching? Well, most of the low-income voters who were switching to the Conservatives were coming direct from the Labour Party. Only about 68% of low-income Labour voters in 2017 stayed with the party in 2019, whereas nearly 90% of low-income voters who'd voted Conservative in 2017 stayed with the Conservatives in 2019. Now, that suggests to me that the Conservatives have built a pretty durable relationship with these voters. It's not only about things on the economic axis, as I'll explain later, but it does suggest that this is not simply a protest vote, that it's anchored in some pretty durable changes underneath the surface of British politics. But again, this was not cost-free. The Conservatives have also at the same time lost support among high-income voters, many of whom have switched over to the Liberal Democrats in affluent leafy seats like Richmond, which is also where I used to live for a time. But what this means is that the Conservatives can no longer be described as the party of the well-off, while Labour is no longer the party of those on low incomes. Labour now has as much support among people who are wealthy on high incomes as it has among people who are on low incomes, while the Conservatives are now more popular among those people on low incomes than they are on people who are wealthy. So both parties have basically seen some pretty big and transformative changes in their overall support. So here is where we are left. If you look at how the different subgroups in British society are now breaking down, this is pretty striking. Here we can see, for example, how those low-income voters at the top are now more likely to be siding with the Conservatives. You can also, in particular, see how people who left school at 16 or 17 with GCSE level qualifications much more likely to be voting Conservative. And we can also see pensioners, people aged over 65 and above, far more likely to vote Conservative, and also white British voters as well. But you can see where Labour's source of strength is coming from. Even though Labour lost the election heavily, they still hold some pretty remarkable leads among black and minority ethnic voters, among 18 to 24-year-olds as well. But we are seeing some pretty remarkable changes. So the question is, what's explaining all of this, and why are all of these voters moving around? Well, as I said earlier, there are lots of voters who do not fit neatly onto the left versus right landscape. Voters are often conflicted, or as I said, cross-pressured. And this is especially true as questions about identity and culture have risen up the political agenda, not just Brexit, but immigration, Islam, diversity, perhaps even the statue wars in the aftermath of the death of George Floyd in the United States have reminded us that these questions around identity and culture, national heritage and history are going to remain pretty salient probably for years to come. And so we can get a sense of whether this is actually happening by looking at people's responses to two pretty important survey questions. The first taps the traditional left versus right economic questions, like whether people's incomes should be made more equal or not. And the second taps into the cultural dimension by asking people their views about whether Britain should stay in or leave the European Union. And what you're looking at in terms of these low-income voters and high-income voters is really where they stand on this axis. And look at the low-income voters for a second, and you can see that sort of blue peak on the right and the sort of red sort of mountain on the left, I suppose. Well, that is showing us quite nicely and neatly how the outlook of these voters basically left them very receptive to Boris Johnson's campaign. On the one hand, he was saying, let's leave the European Union. On the other hand, he was saying, let's level up the country and let's do more for areas that have been left behind. And you can see where these voters are. They lean left on questions of redistribution, but they lean right on the issue of European integration. In other words, there is a large reservoir of support among voters for a party that is economically a bit on the left, promising to tackle economic injustice and inequality, and which is also pro-Brexit, promising to honour the result of the referendum and to reform immigration. And there's no reason why this basic formula won't stay in place. You could, for example, imagine a political party similarly mixing these left-wing themes on economics and these right-wing themes on questions around identity, law and order, national history and culture, and so forth. And so this is the basic public demand that's underpinning British politics that kind of paves the way for the realignment that we saw at the election. But now look at high-income voters on the right. Well, they're far more centrist on economic issues, and they're also far more socially liberal. They're almost on the other side to where low-income voters are. They are pro-European. They're pretty relaxed with Britain's membership of the European Union. They're typically relaxed with issues like migration. How do the parties navigate this tension? Well, 2 years ago, or 2 years before the 2019 general election, Labour basically tried to manage it by fudging the Brexit question, implying that they would respect the result, and then campaigning hard on economic injustice. And that actually made a difference. Jeremy Corbyn basically stopped Theresa May from running riot in the red wall northern seats. But by 2019, Jeremy Corbyn had been pushed by lots of London-based Labour MPs and lots of analysts to embrace the idea of a second referendum on EU membership, to essentially say we need another referendum and we're not just going to honour the result of the first one, but we're going to ask you to vote again. And guess what? voters noticed that shift, and this would end up having some big repercussions. So this is showing you how those low-income voters now saw the Labour Party, whereas they put themselves all the way over here on the Europe question, where you can see that they are much more likely to be saying, let's leave the European Union with that big blue peak on the right. When they are asked to discuss where the Labour Party is, they are actually saying Labour is much more culturally liberal, it's on the left when it comes to this Europe issue and this Europe question in 2019. And this is pretty significant stuff. So even if voters still liked where Labour were on the economy, they now saw the party as being anti-Brexit. And this is a big problem for Labour, given that these cross-pressured voters are very pro-Brexit. In contrast, low-income voters saw the Conservatives as being pro-Brexit, as you can see on the left, and closer to their own position on European issues, even if they still largely see the Conservatives as being to the right on these economic questions, which suggests that the Conservatives may actually have more room for manoeuvre were they to turn up the volume on some of those economic questions alongside their support for things like Brexit. So to hammer home the point and actually what happened at the election and why the Labour Party has been in real difficulty, we can then look at how voters saw the party's positions on the question of Europe between 2017, which is in red, and 2019 in blue. Central point, they noticed a difference. Low-income voters in 2019 saw the Labour Party as having drifted to a Remain position. This opened up a disconnect and a big problem for the Labour Party because these voters then changed their vote accordingly. This is why between 2016 and 2019, I was trying to warn analysts on Twitter who were telling Labour that it would not face any consequences by moving to a Remain position and campaigning for a second referendum. That was mistaken. There were indeed consequences, and that was primarily the collapse of the Red Wall in Northern England. And there we are. Labour lost the Red Wall and arguably could still lose more of it at the next election, given that many of its seats are now more vulnerable and have smaller majorities than they did before the 2019 general election. And just finally, let's quickly look at how these attitudes toward the question of Brexit influence people's vote between 2017 and 2019. Just to hammer home the point, if we look at how people who switched their votes, Conservatives were far more likely to pick up support from people who supported Brexit and somewhat more likely to lose votes among people who had backed Remain. But their success in consolidating the Brexit vote outweighed their losses in Remain seats. And this further explains what happened in 2019 and why Boris Johnson was able to build such a strong coalition of voters. He unified the Leave side, he consolidated the Leave vote, and he then attracted a significant number of switchers by playing on this issue of Brexit, particularly among groups that had noticed a change in Labour's position. Now, if we take a step back, what we have unfolding in British politics, as in many other democracies, is an underlying value divide that is now finding its expression in the broader realignment of our politics. And this has become much more apparent over time. The realignment of our political parties that we saw at the 2019 election reflects deeper shifts that we can see on the slide. On the left, you can see the evolution of our differences on left versus right questions between low-income and high-income groups, and they've basically stayed fairly static between 1987 and all the way through to 2017. And then on the right, you can see how the value divide between low-income and high-income voters, whether they're liberal or whether they are holding more socially conservative or authoritarian views. They want tough approach on law and order. They want cuts to immigration. They want to leave the European Union. Well, we can see how between 2010 and as we come into this Boris Johnson era, the value divide has opened up. So there's a really sort of big new chasm in British politics, and that would also eventually find its expression in other things like people's attitudes toward issues like pulling down statues and various other things. So all of this paints a backdrop to the 2019 election, which delivers a fairly solid Conservative majority. So put all of this together, what are the key points for me? Firstly, we have a Labour Party that is suffering from deep, long-term structural problems in its electorate. That there has arisen and emerged a deep values divide within British politics that I first pointed to 7 or 8 years ago, and that's become much more salient as we've gone through issues like Brexit, immigration, and related issues. Labour's relationship with the working class has been weakening over the longer term. It really can be traced back to the early 2000s under the new Labour government, when we began to see working class voters withdrawing from politics, and many of them then went to the Conservatives or to Nigel Farage. They then voted Leave, and then they turned over to Boris Johnson and the Conservatives. And so what we're talking about is going to be here for the long term. It's going to be here for years, if not decades to come. And it reflects a broader trend that I think is weakening many other centre-left parties that have also not had to navigate Brexit, and they're lucky in that sense, but the same tensions within their electorate between liberal middle-class professionals and socially conservative workers are still also quite visible. What does all of this mean in terms of the future? Well, I think we could perhaps suggest that on the supply side, the Labour Party has also struggled in that many of its MPs themselves have drifted further away from the communities that they need to win back. Lots of work has shown that Labour MPs have generally become more socially liberal and middle class and have downplayed core appeals to these lower income, low wage, and often working class communities. And some of this really does make a difference, because we know also that some of the policies that have been passed have not always been policies that have helped these communities in these areas. So all things considered, everything that we've just been discussing, everything that I've pointed to, doesn't look like it's unique to our Brexit moment, but rather looks like we're dealing with a much broader and deeper realignment of British politics that will be with us, I think, for many years to come.